Hello and welcome to this program. My name is Matthew Needham and I've got the privilege of interviewing Logan Craft, who's the producer of an amazing movie that came out quite a few years ago, but we're going to be looking at the significance and really the message. And first of all, I'm just going to introduce myself and also then let Logan tell us a bit more about him as an introduction, but then we're going to focus on this documentary that was made. I'm a pastor here in New Zealand, and most of my life I've been a missionary and an evangelist, and my goal is to help people to believe in God. That's a bit of a challenge when so many people sort of almost don't want to know, but we do have evidence, we do have reasons why we believe. And myself, I truly knew that I was called by God and have experienced His reality in so many ways. But Logan, to begin with, just to introduce yourself, I would also like to know how you came to faith and why you acknowledge a sovereign creator.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for having me on your program. I'm happy to be here. I originally came to faith when I was a teenager, although I was raised in the church. So I would have to say I'm one of those process Christians. Came to faith or by conversion through a series of events rather than a kind of a black and white, dark and light experience. I was raised in the church by my family, and that happened to be, depending on where we were living, either Anglican or Presbyterian. Through the process of actually going through Anglican confirmation, which is where they take teenagers for those who are outside of more liturgical churches. You go through a process when you're a teenager to confirm your baptism, which normally would have happened when you were small or young or even an infant. So it's kind of baptism in those churches is kind of a two-pillar process. They baptize you, and then they confirm the baptism when you're a teenager, which is really the opportunity you have to go through a personal conversion, if you will, or to assent or affirm the fact that somewhere along the way you actually were converted. And that normally takes place sometime between the ages of 12 and 16 or 17. I was 15 or 16. I was going through this process. I was also reading a book by C.S. Lewis that's very well known, famous, called Mere Christianity. So that was a book whose intent was written by Lewis, like you stated about yourself. Lewis was concerned about people knowing God and meeting God. So that book was written with the intent of bringing about an intellectual conversion, resulting in a emotional commitment, resulting in a decision of the will, which is what I call conversion. So I was reading this book. I was a 15 or 16-year-old teenager. I was going through the formal process of Anglican confirmation, which was quite good, actually. Quite, if you will, orthodox, in presenting who Jesus was, who God is, what the main problems are with the human journey, human existence, evil, life after death, all the main elements. And then I was also, and this was also very key, in our college, or in the United States called high school. In high school, there was a non-denominational ministry. It wasn't Anglican, it wasn't Presbyterian, it wasn't Baptist, it wasn't Catholic. And it was just generally Christian. And it reached out to all the high school students. I went to a very large high school with a lot of students, and so they had a big meeting every week on Monday nights where they had their leaders come in with all the kind of things that teenagers and young people, really wanted. Much better than a youth group at a church. And they also were very evangelistic. So those three things really brought me to the place of what I call personal conversion. And through my life, as I went on and became an adult, a young adult, and then older, what I found was life presents us with new opportunities to ask new questions about God, our Christian faith, other philosophies, religions, or worldviews. And so I've had a number of what I'll call not conversions in the full sense of the word, but sort of resolutions conversions that took place, going through periods where I asked questions I'd never asked before and had doubts that I'd never had before. And I found answers to those. One of the things that became very important to me in that process was apologetics, because I was looking for reasoned and reasonable answers to intellectual questions, that weren't a part necessarily sort of a scripture verse you could quote. I needed a synthesis between philosophy and reason and faith, in the sense of putting your trust in a God and in things about God that were not anti-reason, were not anti-rational, but sort of, went beyond reason. And so I had to have reasonable answers as to why I should go beyond reason, and believe in the supernatural. When I found myself living in a time that was extraordinarily biased, like all of us are living in, where the overarching view is materialism and secularism, which restricts itself to a scientific, not even a scientific, but a scientific view of reality that says all that is or ever was is that which can be measured, can be reduced to scientific formulae. So that was the time we all find ourselves living in, and I found myself challenged by that, and I had to have answers as a Christian as to why I diverged from that mainstream view, or at least that mainstream elitist view, the people who were in control of academy, science, technology, mostly government in the West. So, that was a series of conversions I had, which ultimately resulted in some special work that I did.
So this is really where we get onto the documentary that you have made. And I'll just reminisce, because when I first saw an advert for this documentary, I immediately ordered it. And that's why I've still got the copy here today. I can't remember if it was played in so many movie theatres here in New Zealand, but I ordered the DVD and watched it right early on. And then when I found out that the person who actually helped produce this documentary just lives up the road from me many years later, I thought, well, I've got to meet with you. I've got to talk to you and find out the story. So here we are again, meeting in your art barn. I've heard a bit of wind blowing through the rafters, and it's such an awesome, awesome place. But I really want to know, how did this documentary come about? And I suppose that you'll answer it looking at the state of the institutions, the government, and this anti-God kind of feeling that comes from the world. Mm-hmm. And you were brought in and given this opportunity to do this. How did that come about?
Well, the way that came about was at the time that I began producing the film with two colleague producers from Canada. One was the line producer, and one had a general production role. And then I was the executive producer and producer. And every now and then, by necessity, I was thrown into line producing, which I did have some background in, because I'll explain why. At the time that I made that, I was actually a Presbyterian minister. So I, later on in life, much later than the conversion story I just told you about, I ended up, after a tenure through various businesses, working in business, I ended up becoming an ordained Presbyterian minister. And I had a church with a colleague partner in the capital city of the state of New Mexico. And New Mexico, for those of you who aren't Americans, or for your listeners, New Mexico sits in between Texas and Arizona. And it's a big state geographically, with a relatively small population. Millions and millions of people, but still for the U.S. small. So I found myself in a church in Santa Fe, which I co-founded, this Presbyterian church, with my partner, Martin Bond. And during that time, I had two different extra church or extra ecclesiastical roles So one of them was I had a talk show that was produced locally in the state capitol. And that that program was called Church and State. And in it I explored some of the controversies and some of the conflicts and opportunities that confronted people who were Christians, leadership or otherwise, and in their relationship with the government and laws and the changing kaleidoscope in the United States and in other countries in the West or in the world with how the church and how Christians relate to the government. So I had a talk show that was a weekly talk show. And I was the host, I was the producer, and I'd have various guests on there from religious leaders of all kinds, including non-Christian religious leaders. And I had various politicians on and then activists, so those three groups. So I would have, Roman Catholic bishops, I'd have Buddhist practitioners, I would have rabbis, I would have a lot of different Christian leaders. I'd have activists ranging all the way from LGBTQ activists to very pro-Christian family activists on the program. Sometimes I've had panels. I would have the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney generals, political people on the show. And so it was regionally a well-known show in the state of New Mexico and part of Texas. And it came on every Sunday evening. It was cable cast on the cable network. And then after that, producing that show, I then moved into another form of producing television material. This is in addition to my role as a minister in the Presbyterian Church. And that gave me a lot of experience traveling around the world and producing television programs about outdoor life, since I was an avid outdoor enthusiast my entire life. So I did that for 3 years. When I was approached by my two colleague producers, the men that ended up being my colleagues, I had been very good friends with one of them because my wife and I had lived in Canada prior to living in New Mexico, in Vancouver. And so he knew us and we knew him. And he discovered that I was doing all this television work over a period of years. And he was quite intrigued with that because when he and I knew each other in Canada, I wasn't doing television work. I was doing other kind of work. And so he told me that he and his colleague wanted to produce this film that was very rough sketch. That it wasn't anything like what the film became. It was just they knew they wanted to approach this area of controversy regarding science, scientific censorship, and the issue of biological evolution. And because I had covered that on my TV program, and had been covering, evolutionary things and biological things and the controversy around education and the church teaching evolution in a Darwinian sense, I was, well acquainted with the issue. And so, that when they approached me, I said, well, let me introduce you to some people who might help you financially with it. And I did. I knew some people who might be interested in that topic, so I made the introduction, I set up the meetings, and that ended up being very fruitful in the sense that the people that were in part of my network wanted to invest in this project. Well, shortly after that, then, my colleagues said, look, we really want you to be a part of this in a bigger way. We ultimately worked out a way for me to come on board as the chairman and then the producer with them. It was an interesting arrangement. We all had a 33% vote on critical materials. So there was a way to be there was always going to be a way through a stalemate because we will always be able to break a tie 2 against 1. So my fellow colleague producers, Walt Ruloff and John Sullivan, and I formed an entirely new structure based not in Canada, based in the U.S., and we started moving forward on producing a feature film. That's how I got started on it, and I had been interested in these issues because of the prior work I had done on my television talk show, addressing issues that were related and that were apologetic. And so ultimately, I had to take somewhat of a leave of absence from my church during the final period of the production and release of this film, which had always been intended to be a theatrical release. It was not just a DVD release, not just a straight to pay-per-view release. In fact, it was one of the largest documentary releases in the history of documentaries in the United States when it came out. And it was, until the last month of the year, the most watched documentary in the United States. Even though, having achieved that notoriety, it was never, ever considered for an Academy Award.
Well, I've just recently watched it, and I've got notes which I've collected of different themes. So let's just go through some of the themes of the movie. So the first theme I want to look at is how the film depicts intelligent design as an alternative to evolution. And this design theory is defined in the film as the study of patterns in nature that are best explained as a result of intelligence. And the intelligence design concept of irreducible complexity is the claim that such complexity could not arise from spontaneous mutations. So intelligent design should therefore be considered as an explanation for how life began.
Yes, I think that's a reasonable description, cobbling together 2 or 3 statements by different experts on the film, actually, who state what the argument for intelligent design is, in contradistinction or in contrast with evolution. Although I should mention at this point that evolution is a funny kind of word, as one of the experts reminds us, because it depends on what you mean by evolution. And what people mean when they're offering these explanations for intelligent design, and they contrast it with evolution, they're talking about orthodox or neo-orthodox Darwinian evolutionary theory. And that rests very, very singularly on the reality of random mutation. So when people contrast intelligent design, they're not alleging, depending on who they are, that there is no evolutionary processes going on in the world of living things. What they're arguing for is the fact that random mutation is entirely inadequate an explanation, and in fact, according to most of them, an unsupportable conclusion and an unsupportable support for evolutionary theory. And that was the conclusion, Matthew, that I came to. That whatever was answered or unanswered or could be answered or could never be answered by science or by human beings with their various tools to plumb the depths of history, our own history of life, whatever the limitations were there, it became clear to me, along with many, many other people who were far more well-versed in this discipline than I was, although any educated person and even an uneducated person can come to this conclusion, in my opinion, by looking at the facts, doing your own research. And that is that random mutation as the locomotive for life becoming what it is, quite frankly, a proposition that can no longer be supported. And that's why I supported the film. I realized that if neo-orthodox Darwinian evolutionary theory was going to be held on to unreasonably by science, which is supposed to be the epitome of the disciplines that rely on reason, science, and was going to continue to hold on to this, what was becoming more and more absurd and leading us down the wrong path and giving us a false view of our beginnings, then I thought that needed correction, particularly when I found out just how vicious the censorship of alternative views to that neo-orthodoxy were. Just how vicious the propaganda and the attacks against very qualified scientists who were differing and dissenting from this. So scientific consensus is whenever you hear that used by institutional proponents, all I can say is step back, take a very hard look, and beware. Because scientific consensus is misused.
So if people are willing to start saying there might be evidence of intelligent design, obviously there are so many that don't want to go down that path because that hints of saying there might be a creator, there might be a God.
Yes.
And won't they say, no, we don't want to have anything to do with God and science? But what you're saying is there's good evidence to show that actually this, let's say, for example, the simple cell, that it was so complicatedly designed that neo-Darwinism doesn't have the best explanation, but actually does point towards a creator.
Yes, although on that last phrase, points to a creator, that's where most of the intelligent design proponents, most of who are active, are scientists and researchers and writers. They would be cautious about bolting that on immediately. They would address that perhaps in their writings. Some would not address it, but they would address it separately because they're making the argument that you don't need to bring in theology or even philosophy. You don't need to bring in revelation from any sacred body of writings like the Bible or some other sacred text alleged by others to address this issue. That within the scientific protocol itself and the scientific methodology, there is more than adequate evidence that in this order, excellent evidence that some of the primary pillars that neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory is resting on is wrong. There's excellent evidence that it's flawed and faulty. Excellent. I won't say undeniable, but let's say it's gotten to the point where it is the weight of evidence against these pillars for neo-Darwinian orthodoxy are clearly on the side of the people that are reason and evidentiary based. There is good evidence. There is good evidence, maybe very good evidence, that the other elements that are inherent in life forms, complex life forms, including the irreducible complexity of the cell and of other building blocks, there is very good evidence that not only does that torpedo a reliance on some of the primary constructs of Darwinism, but there is very good evidence that it points to an ultimately ordered and designed universe and reality. Very good evidence. There's better evidence that Darwinism, in its main tenets that it rests on, is wrong. There's good evidence that some of the main tenets for a general theory of intelligent design are true, if you see the distinction. Then lastly, there's good evidence that the design behind this, because in the second one I'm talking about, there's no definition of the designer. Is it God? Is it a force? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it malicious? Is it benign? There's none of that information there, and actually shouldn't be. But there's good evidence that the designer, whatever it is, or he is, if you want to personalize it, actually has a design for life in the sense that it is positive. It's not only benign, it's positive. And then you come lastly to the theological or philosophical question of, well, is this designer God? And, is it supreme? Is it sovereign? Is it all powerful? Is it partly powerful? Is it kind? Is it ultimately loving? Or is it these questions? Then you have to enter into the realm of theology or at least philosophy. The travesty that was going on in science is take the last question away about God. Entirely within the scientific enterprise, a metaphysical position, metaphysical meaning normally atheism, or at least robust agnosticism, and a materialistic view of reality, was being superimposed on science inappropriately, because they were not doing what Christian writers on this subject do, which was like, do the scientific work first, and then let's look at this from a philosophical, theological standpoint, based upon what we're finding in science. No, they were starting from the get-go, very foolishly, and easy to expose. They were starting from the get-go that for some reason known only to them, the metaphysical reality was atheistic and the metaphysical reality was materialistic. And they were using neo-Darwinism as the Genesis story, so to speak, of life and of human life in particular, to support their metaphysical, if you will, faith-based, and it is faith-based, in an inverted way, position. And that was easy to see in the way that they related to their colleagues. Some of them, the colleagues who were, in favor of intelligent design, were not necessarily religious. So this was a very, very volatile issue. And you were right when you say they don't want to go there. Why? Well, ultimately, it lends credibility to the people that say, well, science seems to support the idea of God, certainly as much as it does not support the idea of God. So therefore, we're not crazy or irrational or unreasonable if we're going to believe in God and say, well, there are scientific elements and truths that support that. They had built a castle, a fortress for over 100 years and more, building a fortress that they thought was impregnable. And the watchtowers on the walls were neo-Darwinism. And if those fell, you could see that they felt that their whole construct would come crashing down, and then in their minds, well, anything was possible. Well, what do they mean by anything's possible? You mean anything's possible? People could believe in a God? Well, for some of them, that was a terrible thing. They had a hard time explaining whys. They would trot out the normal litany of abuses from history, the Crusades, the burning of witches, the Inquisition. Yeah. And, more easily you could bring out the flaws and faults of materialist, secular, atheistic philosophy and what that metaphysic had wrought in our world. Purges, concentration camps, millions and millions of deaths, their own forms of inquisition and witch hunts. They don't want to hear that, though. But it's the truth.
So that's why I'll mention what the movie has portrayed regarding the theory of evolution as being a contributor to communism, fascism, atheism, eugenics, this attempt to breed a superior race of human beings, and how that led to things like Nazism and atrocities in the Holocaust. And when we look at Charles Darwin's work in the 19th century, with ideas of survival of the fittest, that really did influence people like Adolf Hitler, and that the Nazis relied on this aspect of Darwinian theory.
Yes, and not just the Nazis. And the sad truth is the Nazis took much of their eugenics philosophy and law, actually a priori, from Great Britain and the United States. And that's not well known, but it's the truth. And in fact, it came up in the Nuremberg trials because they were both drinking at the well. Western civilization was drinking at the well of social Darwinism. This description of survival of the fittest is one component or element attributed to Darwin, but probably much more attributable to some of his later followers, who probably took Darwinism in directions that he would have been very uncomfortable himself personally taking it. So he is not, Darwin himself was not, I want to make clear, the originator, if you will, of social Darwin and social Darwinistic policies that ultimately ended up in eugenics, sort of these severe racist ideologies and the abuse of human beings. I should also point out that social Darwinism was a big part of Bolshevism and communism, and the inevitable dialectic of historical development that they approached, very much built also on the teaching not only of Marx, but also of Darwin. So they were also big neo-Darwinian evolutionists, and they justified a tremendous amount of their pillaging and killing, which was probably equal to or greater than the Nazis, actually, if you want to be frank about it, not because they were racists, but because they were adopting the same kind of grotesque, materialistic, atheistic ideologies. And one of their supports also was Darwinian evolution and social Darwinism, which said not survival of the fittest in the sense that a more pro-capitalist, more pro-Western view of history, but more the ability for the survival of the most fit to fit in with the inevitable historical development of communism. And if you didn't fit in, it meant that you were defective. Not as the Nazis thought about it, or some of the British and American eugenicists, but you were unfit because you were too greedy, or you were too self-centered, or too individualistic. You weren't communitarian enough. You weren't collective enough. You weren't fit. And therefore, you also can be eliminated. So this theory was used coming and going. It was very malleable. It could fit into a lot of violent ideologies, and was. That's the point. It was. And there needs to be a reckoning about that. Our film exposed that amongst many other films and productions. It needs to continue to be exposed because religious ideologies are not the only ones that do bad things. They do bad things. Religious people do bad things. We also need to remind ourselves and everyone else that irreligious people and anti-religious people do very bad things too. And sometimes they have done them on a scale, for various reasons, much greater than religious institutions or people. So the story needs to be told of the dangers of taking this element of their ideology and then expanding that to where ultimately you've got it being used to violate people and even to murder them.
When I look on Wikipedia, what they say about your film, it looks like it's been taken over by those who are so negative and have the anti-God kind of feeling that you're almost, any argument that you would try to bring is immediately sort of shot down and rejected without careful thought.
Yeah.
So how to overcome a society that really doesn't want to think seriously about the possibility of God, even starting with possibility of intelligent design as evidence of the hand of God at work.
Well, Wikipedia is like so many, what has become in itself an institution now, with its biases in any number of ways, whether political bias or biases related to this. So, although Wikipedia has some excellent information, when it gets into the area beyond the facts, ma'am, it can be very misleading. I'll point to the experience we had related to this as a lead-in to my answer to your question by saying when the film came out, and you understand that when it came out, it ultimately became one of the top 10 theatrically released documentaries in U.S. film history. That's A. It was sued immediately and by various parties, which we could get into later if you'd like. And the film became the most watched documentary of the year it came out until it was eclipsed by one film in the last 2 months that had a late release. And it remained in the top 10 of theatrically released documentaries even after this, and it had no advertising beyond the first week. Now that says something. And it had no advertising because of the lawsuits. So I just want to state that, first of all. There's a lot of interest in it. Secondly, I'd like to state that when the movie was reviewed, when it came out prior to showing up in the movie theaters, it's very hard to get documentaries in movie theaters because movie theaters like movies where a lot of people watch them. That's their business. But this film came out on 1,000+ screens. Well, if you're in the movie business, that's a lot of screens in the U.S. We had movie reviewers who wrote reviews about our film and published them in primary publications at that time, which were mostly print media and that had internet presence, web presence. And we had many of the film critics who wrote scathing critiques about our film and never watched it. Imagine that. We had them critique our film and write a scathing review, and they would state, the film is so bad, I refuse to watch it. Now, does that tell you anything? That tells me there's some sort of psychological conditioning going on, and there's some kind of an obstinate disconnect with moral propriety, reason, realism, basic human politeness, understanding at any level. This was severe. This is like a person from another religious tradition saying, I hate the Bible. It is a complete collection of lies, and I've never read it. What do you do with such people? Now, what to do about the problem? Because I wanted to state the grotesqueness of the problem. That's why I'm saying this. I think you resign yourself as an apologist or as an evangelist, which is different, to not become infatuated with numbers, but to become infatuated with the truth and loving people, with the truth and goodness and beauty, and with the inherent value of every person who we believe has been made as a species, as a Homo sapien, has been made peculiarly in the image of God in miniature, and whose destiny is potentially one, as C.S. Lewis has reminded us in one of his famous books, that if we were to see a translated person in heaven, no matter how dull they might have been here, or insignificant or inconsequential, we would be, in our present state now, we would be tempted to worship such a human creature because they would be so remarkable and so remarkably beautiful and so remarkably glorious. That is the potential destiny for...
Well, that's what happened with the Apostle John when he saw an angel, and the angel had to rebuke him and say, no, only worship God.
Don't worship me. That's right. Lewis is pointing that out, not to encourage us to worship perfected, resurrected human beings, but only to remind us just how astounding our proximity is to the likeness of God, like angels. But even in some ways more so, since angels never had, at least according to Christians, the thing that makes us unique is the incarnation and the fact that God actually became one of these creatures, not an angel.
Jesus became one of us.
One of us, and is still one of us, if you will, just in a resurrected state. And so that importance of human beings, no matter who they are, no matter what their disability may be, or their character flaws, or their personality defects, or the makeup of their intelligence, or their physical abilities, or lack of, means everybody's important, no matter how old, no matter what race, no matter what gender, no matter what ability. So, how to overcome this culturally? I can tell you that I've come to these conclusions. There is no cultural overcoming of this bias without the support, and this may sound very strange, but I'm going to say it because I believe it, and I've come to the conclusion. There is no cultural overcoming of it without the support of the primary institutions that make up a culture. And that means a scientific institution, writ large, and joined to it the medical community, which is a part of science. It also means education and the academy, both higher and primary institutions of learning. And I'm going to say something quite shocking for some listeners. And it also doesn't happen at a cultural level without the state's endorsement. If there's no endorsement of the state for the metaphysical positions that Christians would hold as primary, then there will be no cultural overcoming. There may be individual overcoming and even significant individual overcoming. We may reach many people. We may create many subcultural institutions. But without those primary institutions being converted, there is no wholesale, dominant cultural win for a supernatural designer, God-existing view of reality. Whether those cultural institutions will ever change again and support a metaphysic of theism and of Christianity as they did in the West is beyond my pay grade to answer.
Well, there certainly was a time when the majority of scientists were Christians, but even more than that, they actually acknowledged a personal relationship, a friendship with God.
Correct.
And it was mentioned in the movie, people like Sir Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, Johannes Kepler, who was called God's mathematician, Galileo, not only believed in God, but thought that their belief in God is what actually made science easier to do. So there has been in this past this rich history of Christianity and science, which is ignored today and is fiercely being ignored.
Yeah, it is fiercely ignored because it's an uncomfortable truth for the current metaphysical atheistic guardians of the scientific enterprise and the Institute of Science writ large. Again, there are exceptions within the project of science, both at an institutional level and as a subculture. But the reason why this doesn't get large-scale public dissemination is because the guardians, historically in the last 100 years, who have been progressively leading and protecting the metaphysic they've attached to the scientific enterprise, they will not allow these explorations or even the historical reviews which would point out to these truths. Whether this will come again, it will change. Let's say, broadly written, said, in favor of God, in favor of what I think is a much more realistic view of reality, even if you don't embrace the Christian God. It's much more realistic to embrace a designer being existent.
I'll mention one of the things that comes up in the documentary as proof of intelligence.
Yes.
When we find information in the DNA molecule, the most likely explanation is that it too had an intelligent source. We need engineering principles to understand the systems found within a living cell. Intelligent design is a legitimate method of inquiry. When science points to an intelligent creator, we should accept that possibility.
When science says that there is the possibility of an intelligent designer, and when philosophers and theologians would opine that the nature of that designer is a creator, which are two different things. We as Christians accept that the designer is a creator. Others would say the designer would be maybe a creator, but not in the same sense we would.
But well, that doesn't matter. We just want to get to the first step in society where people are willing to look at the evidence and say
there's a designer, because that leads quickly through logic and reason, let alone the impact of supernatural, spiritual realities that affect people for the good, which we would say are realities that exist in this world, we would say. When you combine all of that, then you have a lot of opportunity for people to get to know God, to be brought into God's family, not just as a creature, not merely as a servant, because you're a creature that He's made, but as a family member, which is with all the privileges of being a family member. Then that's what we want. Right now, we are faced with the tragic dilemma still, where most of the people in the West, the majority, are not even able to get to the first base of admitting that they are a creature, let alone a servant, let alone a family member. These things are progressive. To get to the one, you kind of have to go through the first loop, like you said. And the first loop is, by the way, the evidence lends itself very clearly, apart from the Bible or the sacred texts of the church or the systematic theology the church has developed or whatever else, the evidence there in nature from the scientific method, the weightier evidence tells us there is a designer, and it's quite reasonable to believe that He is a creator, and it's not unreasonable to believe that He is a personal creator, like personal. So I tell people the reason you have a personality, an individual personality, is because God has one. He gave it to you. It's not as if you acquired that on your own. Where did you get that personality from? It's not as if He's just an energy or a force. He is that. But He's much more. He's personal. We're made of energy. We have a force to us, right? But don't we like to think that we're more than that?
Yeah, I remember one person on the film, he was so dogmatic that there is no life after death, there's no God. And the strength of which he said that, just having experienced God myself, just filled my heart with sadness, because I want to say with strength that our society needs to come back to God. We have gone onto the wrong path. We need to come back into the light. And I'm just thrilled with any presentation of the facts that can try and help people to get to that stage one. So yes, I know in the film you're just trying to present stage one, but if we can get our society past stage one, that can lead others to come into this family of God that you're talking about.
From an evidentiary standpoint, the film is based on stage one, but there are strong allusions to stage two and even stage three in the film. And by the way, the producers had quite a bit of argument and discussion about how much of those two we should allow. The particular individual you mentioned that was adamant about there not being an afterlife, no life after death, and no God, to me is an interesting icon for our time. He represents to me Western culture. He started off coming from a religious background, that particular scientist. And by the way, he's dying of a brain tumor in the film, like in real life. He was dying of a brain tumor, confronted with the extinguishing of his life. And he was still adamantly holding on to his atheism.
That's what I'm facing all the time, because I'm often working with elderly, I'm working with people on their deathbed. And thankfully, because they are coming close to death, some of them actually do open their hearts.
Yes.
But those who don't, they're the ones feel so sad for them.
Of course you do. And it's a sadness that's rooted in reality. Because they're confronting the unknown, and they're confronting it unsafely, and with no comfort, and with no positive reinforcement for their future. To me, Western culture is like that man in the film. Western culture has a brain tumor. It obviously something's not right with Western culture. Having sought reason as the epitome of the basis of its self-understanding, it's now entered into a time of irrationality and irreducible frivolity bordering on the absurd. That's the state of Western culture in general, whether it's the Anglosphere or Europe or elsewhere. And they continue to hold on at the cultural level to this materialistic, atheistic, agnostic bias. Even though the culture is dying, as it were, from a culturally sized brain tumor. And the end is clear. It's near. The end of the culture is near. And it was the Christian culture, just as Israel was the Jewish culture. And it too ended in about 70 AD in that form. And so Western culture is coming to its own reckoning. And it is in the danger zone of death, in my opinion. And we have options before us in that state. Why was he holding on to such a irrational metaphysic in the face of death? Well, it's because early on he'd come from a religious family. And he had been taught things without any scientific support that were presented to him through his coming of age, through his development, that were realities. Well, he got into science and he realized that some of those things were not necessarily scientifically supportable. And then he did something that was, I think, a very poor decision. He decided, therefore, there was no support in science for any theistic or Christian viewpoints, which was wrong. It was a fallacy, but he adopted it. And this is what Western culture has done, and that's why I call him an icon for our culture. Western culture was originally Christian, and there were many things that were presented to people as individuals and at a cultural level that were Christian viewpoints of reality that had no real scientific support. I'm not saying science was necessarily against those things. There was just no evidence. And yet they were presented as factual without a question. When the scientific enterprise grew to a certain point and people in the culture realized there was no support for what my ancestors had taught me, my own family of origin maybe, then they superimposed that kind of skepticism at a 100% level on all religious and all theistic viewpoints. And this was a great tragedy, a very sophomoric.
Despite the fact that there were all these Christian scientists
Yes.
who brought out wonderful examples.
Correct. And I think if you look closely under the rug, both at individuals during this process of change that we went through in the West, and the culture as a whole, what you'll find what people were doing, both individually and culturally, we were really using our skepticism in the West and attaching it to scientific evidences, so-called. But really what it was a cover-up for misbehavior. It was a cover-up for increasingly bad morals. It was a cover for, in one way or another, in one level, increasingly at a level, of disobeying the basic commandments we knew as human beings to be right. And we used scientific skepticism as our excuse when really what we were becoming was morally depraved more and more. Not in all ways. Some things were getting better, I'll admit. But many things were getting worse. And I think that ultimately we were using culturally scientism and scientific skepticism as our excuse so that we could, so to speak, go wild, party, sleep with whoever we want to, marry whenever, however we wanted to, and misuse and abuse people, even to the point, I should remind us, at a cultural level, putting people in concentration camps for reasons that we just didn't like them. That's what the West, the journey it's been on in this era of scientific skepticism used as a bludgeon and as a false support for the atheistic, agnostic viewpoint that it's embraced. I think there's an answer for individuals with work we do like Expelled and anything else. But I'll say this again. I do not think there is a cultural level remedy without the participation of the primary institutions in the culture. And there
would take a move of God, which would take repentance, people acknowledging we have sinned, we have done wrong.
It would.
We need to humble ourselves before this God that we didn't want to believe in.
That's completely true. It would require a turning back again to not everything. Obviously, some things weren't good. But to the primary things that have to do with being a human being in relationship with their Creator. Yes, there would have to be a renaissance, a renewal, a revival, a rebirth, if you will, at a cultural level. And will that happen in the West? Well,
America has had such an amazing history of Christian revivals.
Yes.
And it seems to be there's even movements among students in universities worshipping God in mass numbers.
Yes.
But obviously the establishment doesn't want to allow that to touch their sacred cows.
You're correct. It does not. But that hasn't stopped movements before, and I don't think it was restricted to the United States, from ultimately touching those sacred cows and actually, barbecuing those sacred cows effectively. So it could happen again. I think there are signs that we can look at in the world now and see that it may very well happen in places where it will happen or prevail or not. I'm not prepared to say. What I will say is I remain hopeful for parts of the world, and I certainly remain hopeful for people, regardless of what happens in their particular culture, wherever they are in the world, because I believe that God is real, I believe that Christianity is true, and I believe that our basic foundational elements are very good for people and are essential for their eternal well-being.
So coming to these people who sued the movie.
Yes.
Do you think they were doing it for their own personal monetary gain? Or do you think there is just such an anti-God feeling that they just don't want to be associated with any movie that might be saying that there is intelligent design in the universe?
Yeah. Well, I think to answer that question, I think it was a combination of both. So we were sued, the film production company, by three different entities separately. So one, we were sued by Yoko Ono, John Lennon's widow, and we were sued by John Lennon's sons, one by Yoko Ono and another by another woman, Sean and Julian Lennon. So collectively together, Yoko Ono, Sean, and Julian sued us for one alleged wrongdoing. We were also sued by what at that time was the largest record company in the world, EMI Records. So by a long measure, the largest. They also sued us for another kind of alleged infringement. Then we were sued separate from them by Harvard University, or by a encapsulated subsidiary of Harvard, over a completely different set of allegations. So we were the defendant in three lawsuits, and these lawsuits occurred at various stages of the film's production or right after its release, which crippled its release because we were under not an injunction not to advertise, but we were under extreme legal duress to be sued and then to continue to advertise the film would have put us in a legal predicament with our investors. We could continue to run the film out, but it ran without any advertising, which is never done, ever, unless people just can't afford to advertise. We could, but we were faced with a lawsuit. Why did these parties sue us? Well, in the case of the Lennons, they sued us because we used 21 seconds of John Lennon's Imagine, which he wrote, and they copyrighted, and that family owned. in our film. And we used it criticizing not the melody or the tune, which is quite good, I think, but the lyrics, which are, from our standpoint, quite bad. Or at least most of the lyrics are bad, because it presents an atheistic view of reality. And so we were putting that into the film, talking about social Darwinism. So we inserted it not as the lead opening of the film or the closing. It was inserted to tell a story at a certain point. We used that under a United States, and actually mostly globally, but the United States has various laws around this called fair use. So you can use, without paying a royalty, which we would have been willing to pay if they had allowed us to use the piece. They were never going to let us use it, so there was no point. So we used it under fair use. And fair use protects the short use, 21 seconds is well within the period that's allowed. You could go longer. And then we criticized the piece. Well, you got to be able to do this in a free society. Play excerpts and say, okay, I think this is terrible, what they said, what this song is about, what this movie clip is stating. So we used that. They sued us, and I'm sure that their attorneys told them that they probably would not win. They did it for two reasons. One, Yoko Ono is a very rabid spiritualist. I think I'll say that broadly, without getting into the definition of what kind of spiritualist she is. But she's certainly not a Christian. And
so that would lead her to be anti-Christian?
That would lead us to be her to be anti-Christian. Also the fact, tragically, her husband was shot and killed by a person who had been, anyway, a fundamentalist Christian at one time. Whether he was at the time that he killed John Lennon or afterwards, I don't know, but he certainly had been.
Well, he was a murderer, and Jesus said,
"Don't murder."
Murderers belong to the devil.
That's right. But that might have colored her opinion. So I'm not here to judge Yoko Ono's personal emotions, except to say that from an ideological standpoint, she was opposed to our message. I'm sure that her lawyers were saying, look, they're using it legally probably, but we want to keep anybody out there that's thinking about using your song that borders on illegal or starts using it sort of, more often. We want to nip that in the bud. So they did it for legal, financial reasons too. Dampen the enthusiasm about using Imagine, even if you're using it under fair use. EMI Records, very similar. They own the only recording of John Lennon's Imagine, not the Lennons. EMI Records owned the recording rights. They sued us for the misuse of the recording right, very similarly. But that was in a state court in New York. The copyright court under the Lennons was in federal court in Manhattan, in the Southern District, arguably one of the most important federal districts and difficult districts to have a lawsuit in the United States. And I would also argue it one of the most corrupt, for sure. But anyway, regardless of that, Harvard sued us for use of animation, that one of their animators who had made some animation about the cell and the complexity of the cell and all that, he got huffy because our animation was better. And we paid a bunch of money for our animation to an animator who did not copy the Harvard. It just looks similar because animation tools, there are only so many animation tools. And if you're going to depict the cell looks like what the cell looks like. And so they're going to look similar. So he sued us, trying to establish some kind of chain of use and abuse. None of these people prevailed. All the judges came out and opined and said, we find that the defendants are clearly within their rights, probably, and that if the case progresses further, the plaintiffs will not prevail.
Do you think with these obstacles and that kind of thing, it actually helped maybe to get your message to some places or stir up some people? And did you actually accomplish what you were hoping to accomplish through this documentary?
Well, we certainly accomplished reaching a lot of people. Because of the lawsuits, the film did not achieve the financial hopes that we had. Also, without the lawsuits, we would have reached more people. There was a way to turn the lawsuits at the time into a positive effect. We would, in reflection, have to have been a lot more cavalier and bold, and to the level of facing down, our $1 million law firms and Stanford Law School, who, by the way, came to our assistance out of nowhere, not by our request. Stanford Law School tried our case. Stanford, not exactly the bastion for, Orthodox Christianity. They came to our assistance for issues of freedom of speech and actually argued our case in front of the judges in New York. So even with that, though, we would have had to face down our attorneys, indirectly our investors, and say, well, to heck with this. We appreciate your advice, but no thanks. We didn't do that. On reflection, I would have done that. The film still was a great achievement for first-time film producers. It was a very well-made film, if I can say so. I'm proud of the work we did. It is not B-quality filmmaking. Better films exist, way better. Better documentaries exist, much better. But it's a very good film, and it's very reasonable film.
So it did something for the time.
It did something significant for the time. I still find people, I come across them when they find out one way or another that I was involved with Expelled as a producer, that the film had a personal impact on them. I still, on an airplane, in a dinner party, at a church, in the most random places, the film has been seen by millions and millions of people, either in the theater, on pay-per-view, on a DVD, or some other means. So am I happy about that? I'm thrilled that it had that effect.
Have you still sort of followed where the climate has gone in America between the debate of evolution and intelligent design? Has there been progress with scientists who have seen evidence for intelligent design?
My answer to that has to be, first of all, couched with this caveat. And the fact is that I'm not well studied in the issue anymore as to that particular aspect. But my intuition is, based on staying generally educated in this area, is that actually progress has been made. And I think it's mainly not because of our film, but collectively our film and 1,000 other voices, articles, symposia, lectures, papers, letters, lawsuits, firings, that I think that there has been a loosening of Darwinian orthodoxy to make room for a creator. And I think this is also going hand in hand with a bit of a change, more open to supernatural spirituality, some of which is very good, some of which may be very bad. But the point is that the hold that sort of, hard-boiled materialists have, who at the, their zenith in the 1960s or 50s or 70s or whenever, their zenith of control over the culture has attritioned for all kind of reasons. And so I think there is a greater space for scientists and others to say, look, an intelligent design offers some answers to this. And I don't think they would necessarily be persecuted like some of the professors that are pointed out in our film. And I think that's a wonderful thing that may have changed. Again, I may be completely misdirected in my comments here, but that's my sense. At the same time, we see scientific censorship, which is really what the film was about. It was about censorship. It just happened to be attached to a particular issue. Well, I think scientific censorship and censorship in general on any number of important issues has obviously, in our own time, at this moment, become of supreme importance. Like the issue, if you will, politically, and scientifically, and in many other areas.
Well, I'll have to meet with you again to just
to go over
keep
that.
discussing a lot of things. But I just thank you that even today we've been able to make a voice for intelligent design, that God is real. I'm a 100% believer. I acknowledge Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and I encourage, even if this hasn't pulled you too much into being convinced that, yeah, I need to believe in God, but maybe it's just helping you to come to that first step, to open your heart to the possibility that there is more to life than meets the eye. And I just thank you so much, Logan, to be able to meet with you again, and I'll have to do it again. We'll have to keep talking. And I know you've got a depth of experience, a journey, other parts of the journey that I'd love to hear, how God has taken you through. So again, I speak blessing of God upon you and blessing upon everybody who's been watching today.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome.